March 24, 1945, 30,000 feet above Berlin, the sky is a maze of flak bursts, each one a black flower of shrapnel blooming at 400 miles per hour. Inside the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang with a distinctive red tail, Second Lieutenant Roscoe Brown scans the horizon through the oil-smeared windscreen. The temperature outside is 40 below zero. Inside his leather jacket, sweat runs down his spine. Behind him, stretching for miles, a formation of American B-17 bombers lumber toward their target like a herd of elephants. They carry tons of explosives, hundreds of young men, and something else. They carry the burden of proof. Because the pilots protecting them today aren't supposed to be capable of this. The men in those red-tailed Mustangs were told by their own military, by their own country, by scientists and generals and politicians that their brains were too small, that their reflexes were too slow, that they lacked the intelligence, the courage, the moral fiber to fly. Combat aircraft. They were trained at a segregated base in the Alabama desert where they couldn't eat in the same restaurants, drink from the same water fountains, or stay in the same hotels as the white pilots they trained alongside. And now, in the burning sky above the capital of the Third Reich, they're about to prove everyone wrong. But before we dive deeper into one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments right now. Are you in Lagos, London, Los Angeles? Let me know, because this story belongs to all of us, and I want to see how far across the globe it reaches. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're uncovering the history they didn't teach you in school, one episode at a time. Now, let me take you back to where this story really begins, because what happened over Berlin that day was the culmination of a battle that started long before the first shot was fired in Europe. The year is 1925. The United States Army War College publishes a study, not a casual memo, not an opinion piece. An official military study compiled by officers, reviewed by commanders, distributed throughout the armed forces. The title might as well have been carved in stone. Employment of Negro Manpower in War. The conclusions read like something from a nightmare. Black Americans, the study declared, were cowards. They were mentally inferior. They panicked under fire. They lacked initiative. They could not be trusted with complex machinery. They could never, under any circumstances, be trained as pilots. This wasn't just racism. This was racism with footnotes, with data tables, with the full weight of institutional authority behind it. This was racism dressed up in the uniform of science, given the legitimacy of military doctrine, and used as justification for a system of segregation that permeated every level of American society and its armed forces. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine being told by your own country, the country your father fought for in World War I, the country whose flag hangs outside your home, that you are biologically incapable of courage, that your mind cannot grasp the complexities of aerial combat, that you are by nature inferior. And then war comes. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States is thrust into a global conflict that will require every ounce of its strength, every resource, every capable person. Suddenly, the nation needs pilots, desperately. The Army Air Corps is expanding at a staggering rate, training thousands of young men to take to the skies. But there's a problem. Black Americans want to serve, they want to fight, they want to fly. And the military doesn't want them. This is where the story could have ended. This is where it had ended 100 times before, in 100 different contexts. But something was different this time. Pressure was building from civil rights organizations, from black newspapers that refused to stay silent, from lawyers like Thurgood Marshall, who would later sit on the Supreme Court, but who spent 1940 filing lawsuits, from the logic of the war itself, a war against Nazi racial supremacy being fought by a nation enforcing its own racial hierarchy. The administration of Franklin Roosevelt needed black votes. The military needed bodies. And so, in a moment that was one part cynicism, one part political calculation, and maybe, just maybe, one part genuine belief in American ideals, a decision was made. There would be an experiment, a test, a program to train black pilots, not because anyone believed they would succeed, but to prove, once and for all, that the War College study had been right all along. They chose Tuskegee, Alabama. Let that sink in. Alabama. Deep in the Jim Crow South, where segregation wasn't just law, but religion, where the Ku Klux Klan operated openly, where black Americans lived under a system designed to remind them daily of their assigned place in the social order. This is where they would prove they could be pilots. The Tuskegee Army Airfield wasn't ready when the first cadets arrived in 1941. Nothing was ready. The barracks were unfinished. The runways were rough. The facilities were, predictably, segregated. Black cadets would live in separate quarters, eat in separate mess halls, use separate facilities. They would train to defend democracy in a state where most of them couldn't vote, couldn't testify against white people in court, couldn't sit at a lunch counter next to the white instructors, teaching them to fly. And here's the beautiful, terrible irony that defined everything that followed. The military set this program up to fail. They put it in the most hostile environment they could find. They gave it minimal resources. They assigned commanders who didn't believe in it. They created obstacles at every turn. And then they set standards that were higher than those applied to white aviation cadets. Tuskegee washout rates for the primary trainer had to be below 35%. For white units, they could be as high as 50% and still be considered acceptable. The black cadets had to be better, significantly better, just to be considered equal. The training was brutal. Start with primary flight training on the PT-17 Stearman, a biplane that was forgiving enough for beginners, but unforgiving of stupidity. The cadets learned to take off, to land, to recover from stalls and spins. They flew in the Alabama heat, where the air was thick and turbulent. They flew in formation, wingtip to wingtip, learning to trust their fellow pilots with their lives. Then came basic training on the BT-13 Valiant, nicknamed the Vultee Vibrator because of the way it shook. Faster than the Stearman, heavier, more complex. More ways to kill yourself if you screwed up. Instrument flying, night flying. Cross-country navigation where one mistake could leave you lost over hundreds of miles of countryside with no radar and limited radio. Then advanced training on the AT-6 Texan, a plane that handled like a fighter because it was designed to prepare you for fighters. Gunnery training, dive bombing. Formation flying at speeds over 200 miles per hour. Aerobatics that pushed human bodies to the edge of consciousness. The standards were merciless. Make too many mistakes? Washed out. Fail a check ride? Washed out. Show insufficient aggression in a training dogfight? washed out. The instructors were looking for any excuse to prove the program was a failure, and yet the cadets kept succeeding. Their primary instructor for many was Charles Chief Anderson, a black civilian pilot who had logged thousands of hours when most of these young men had never been inside an aircraft. Anderson was a legend. He had barnstormed across America in the 1930s, giving flying exhibitions when black pilots were rare enough to be newsworthy. He had flown Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady herself, in 1941, and that flight, that image of the president's wife trusting a black pilot with her life, had done more to legitimize the program than 1,000 government studies. But the true architect of what these men were becoming was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the first black graduate of West Point in the 20th century, a man who had endured 4 years of complete and total silence from his white classmates at the academy. 4 years where not a single cadet spoke to him except when required by duty. 4 years of eating alone, studying alone, walking the grounds alone. 4 years that forged him into something harder than steel. Davis understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about training pilots. This was about proving that an entire race of people could do something they had been told was impossible. Every cadet who washed out would be used as evidence of black inferiority. Every accident, every mistake, every failure would be amplified and analyzed and turned into proof that the experiment should be shut down. The weight on these young men's shoulders was incomprehensible. They came from everywhere, from Chicago and Detroit, from small towns in Mississippi and Georgia, from New York City and Los Angeles. Some had college degrees from Howard or Tuskegee Institute. Some had never finished high school but had lied about their education because they were determined to fly. They came from different backgrounds, different dialects, different economic classes. What united them was the certainty that they were carrying something larger than themselves. In the barracks at night, after 14-hour days, they studied aircraft recognition, engine mechanics, navigation, meteorology, Morse code, radio procedures, gunnery solutions that required mental mathematics most college graduates couldn't do. They studied harder than the white cadets because they had to. They supported each other because they had no choice. When one man struggled with aerodynamics, 3 others would tutor him after lights out. When someone was on the verge of washing out, the group rallied, pooled their knowledge, refused to let him fail. They understood that they were not individuals, they were representatives, and slowly, impossibly, they succeeded. In March 1942, the first class graduated. 5 men, 5 pilots with silver wings pinned to their chests. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Lemuel Custis, Charles DeBow, George Roberts, Mac Ross. 5 men who had done something they'd been told was impossible. The graduation ceremony was attended by dignitaries and press. Cameras flashed. Speeches were made about progress and opportunity, and then the 5 new pilots were sent to a segregated airfield and told to wait. Because nobody had actually planned what to do with black fighter pilots. Nobody had thought they'd make it this far. More classes graduated. By the end of 1942, there were enough pilots to form a fighter squadron, the 99th Fighter Squadron. They trained on P-40 Warhawks, rugged aircraft with shark teeth painted on the nose, the same planes the Flying Tigers had made famous in China. They flew mock combat missions over Alabama. They practiced dive bombing and strafing. They waited for orders to deploy overseas. Those orders came in April 1943. The 99th Fighter Squadron was going to North Africa. They would be attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, a white unit that had been in combat for months. They would fly missions over the Mediterranean, supporting the Allied invasion of Sicily and then Italy. They would finally get their chance to prove themselves in combat. And here's where the story takes a turn. Because combat is not like training. Combat is chaos. Combat is three-dimensional chess played at 400 miles per hour while people are actively trying to kill you. Combat is fear and adrenaline and split-second decisions where the wrong choice means you die, or your wingman dies, or both. Combat reveals everything. The 99th flew their first combat mission on June 2, 1943, dive-bombing a German-held island off the coast of Sicily. They encountered flak, the anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with jagged metal fragments. They dove through it, released their bombs, pulled up hard enough to gray out their vision, and made it home. One mission down, hundreds to go. They flew ground attack missions, strafing enemy positions with 50 caliber machine guns. They flew escort missions, protecting bombers on their way to targets. They encountered German fighters, the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, that were the best aircraft the Luftwaffe could field. They fought, they won some, they lost some. Lieutenant Charles Hall scored the squadron's first aerial victory in July, shooting down a German fighter over Sicily. They lost their first pilot, Lieutenant Sherman White, when his plane was hit by ground fire, and he couldn't recover. And almost immediately, the whispers started. The 99th wasn't aggressive enough. They weren't scoring enough kills. They were timid in combat. The critiques came from officers who had never flown with them, who never witnessed what they faced, who were looking for any excuse to shut down the experiment. A report was filed by Colonel William Momier, commander of the 33rd Fighter Group, stating that the 99th was inferior to white squadrons. The report made its way up the chain of command. It reached Washington. It threatened to end the entire program. Everything these men had fought for, everything they had endured, was about to be dismissed because of one racist commander's report. But something happened. The War Department ordered a study, an actual, impartial study, comparing the 99th's performance to other P-40 squadrons in the theater. The results? The 99th was average, not exceptional, but not inferior. They had flown in difficult conditions, faced experienced enemy pilots, and performed exactly as well as comparable white units. The attempt to shut down the program had failed. More than that, the Tuskegee pipeline was producing more pilots than a single squadron could absorb. In 1943, 3 more squadrons were formed, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Together with the 99th, they would form the 332nd Fighter Group. And in January 1944, they were sent to Italy. This is where the legend was born. This is where the Red Tails would earn their place in history. But the real story is more complex, more human, more devastating than the myth suggests. The 332nd was assigned to the 15th Air Force, based in Italy, tasked with one of the most dangerous missions in the air war, bomber escort. The 15th was flying daylight raids deep into German-occupied Europe, targets in Austria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and eventually Germany itself. The bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were slow and vulnerable. German fighters would attack them in waves, trying to break up the formations, to isolate individual bombers, and destroy them. The fighter escorts had to protect them, had to stay with them, had to fight off attackers while maintaining formation discipline. Most fighter groups hated escort duty. It was boring until it was terrifying. It required flying at the speed of the bombers, which meant you were slower and less maneuverable if you were jumped by enemy fighters. The temptation was always to leave the bombers, to chase after enemy fighters, to score kills, and earn glory. Fighter pilots were competitive. They wanted aces, wanted their names in the newspapers, wanted to be heroes. The 332nd developed a different philosophy. Maybe it was because they had something to prove. Maybe it was because they understood the stakes better than anyone. Maybe it was because Colonel Davis, now commanding the group, drilled it into them every single day. Whatever the reason, the red tails stayed with the bombers. They didn't leave to chase kills. They didn't peel off to pursue enemy fighters beyond the range where they could return to protect the formation. They stayed, and the bomber crews noticed. Word spread. If you saw red tails in the sky, you were going to make it home. The 332nd had your back. Bomber crews started requesting them specifically. White bomber crews who had grown up in the same segregated America, who had heard the same lies about black inferiority, who might have worn sheets on Saturday nights back home, looked up at those red-tailed Mustangs and felt safe. The aircraft had evolved. The 332nd started with P-39 Airacobras, mediocre fighters that were better suited to ground attack. Then they transitioned to P-47 Thunderbolts, massive, rugged aircraft that could take tremendous punishment. And finally, in July 1944, they received P-51 Mustangs, the best fighter aircraft in the American arsenal. Long range, fast, maneuverable, armed with 6 .50 caliber machine guns. The Mustang was what they had been waiting for. They painted them red, nose to tail, bright red, impossible to miss, visible from miles away. Some military historians say it was impractical, made them easier for enemies to spot. Maybe. But it also meant that every bomber crew, every Allied pilot, every man fighting over European skies knew who they were, the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, and they were coming to save your life. The missions were relentless. January 1945, a mission to Linz, Austria, 5 hours in the air, flak so thick you could walk on it. German Me-262 jets, the first operational jet fighters, screaming through the formation at speeds no piston-engine aircraft could match. The 332nd fought them off, stayed with the bombers, brought everyone home. February 1945, a mission to Berlin, 600 miles each way, into the heart of Germany, the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. German fighters rising to defend their capital. The Red Tails flew through it all, stayed in formation, protected their charges, lost aircraft, lost men, but brought the bombers through. March 1945. We're back where we started. Roscoe Brown is scanning the sky above Berlin, and then he sees them, 3 Me-262 jets, diving on the bomber formation at over 500 miles per hour. The jets were almost invincible, too fast to catch in a straight chase, armed with 30-millimeter cannons that could destroy a B-17 with a single burst. They were the Luftwaffe's last desperate weapon, and they were deadly. Brown doesn't think. There's no time to think. He shoves the throttle forward, puts his Mustang into a dive, calculates angles and closure rates and lead distances that would take a mathematician 10 minutes, but that a fighter pilot's brain processes in a heartbeat. He opens fire. Tracers arc through the sky. The lead Me-262 tries to evade, but it's already committed to its attack run. Brown's rounds find it. The jet begins to trail smoke, rolls, falls away. A kill. One of only two Me-262s that the 332nd would shoot down during the war. Brown lands back in Italy hours later, exhausted, exhilarated, and adds another small mark to a tally that's being kept in squadron records and in the hearts of the bomber crews they protected. Over the course of the war, the 332nd Fighter Group flew more than 15,000 sorties. They escorted bombers on hundreds of missions, deep into enemy territory, through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. They engaged German fighters in aerial combat and won, shooting down at least 112 enemy aircraft in the air. They destroyed another 150 aircraft on the ground during strafing runs. They destroyed locomotives, trucks, buildings, fuel depots, anything that could support the German war machine. And now we come to it. The claim, the legend, the story that has been told and retold and written in books and repeated on websites and carved into monuments. The Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber to enemy fighters, not one. Out of hundreds of escort missions, through the most intense aerial combat of World War II against the best pilots the Luftwaffe could field, they never lost a bomber they were escorting. It's a beautiful story, it's inspiring, it's powerful, and it's more complicated than that. Here's the truth. The 332nd did have an exceptional record, better than most fighter groups. The bomber crews adored them and requested them specifically, but were they perfect? Did they literally never lose a single bomber? No. That claim doesn't hold up under historical scrutiny. Records show that bombers were lost on missions where the 332nd provided escort. Not many, but some. How do we reconcile that? The answer is that the legend contains a deeper truth than the literal facts. What made the Red Tails different wasn't that they were superhuman or invincible. What made them different was their dedication. Other fighter groups would leave bombers to chase enemy fighters seeking glory and kills. The 332nd stayed. They made different choices. They prioritized protection over personal advancement. And the result was that their bomber loss rate was remarkably, almost incredibly low. Lower than other groups. Low enough that the crews noticed and spread the word. And the legend grew. The myth of perfection, of never losing a single bomber, may not be literally true, but the spirit of it is true. The commitment was true, the sacrifice was true, and in the broader sense, what they proved was absolutely undeniably true, because here's what really matters. The Tuskegee Airmen had to be better, not just as good, better. They had to overcome obstacles that white pilots never faced. They had to prove themselves under standards that were higher and less forgiving. They had to fight two wars simultaneously, one against the Germans, one against the racism of their own military and society. Every mission they flew was flown under the weight of representation. Every decision they made was scrutinized. Every mistake was amplified. Every success had to be extraordinary just to be acknowledged as adequate. They couldn't just be pilots. They had to be perfect pilots. And while no human being can achieve perfection, these men came closer than anyone had a right to expect. They paid for it. 66 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action during World War II. 32 were shot down and captured, spending months or years in German prisoner of war camps. They died over Austria and Germany and Italy and Yugoslavia. They died in aerial combat and ground attack missions and training accidents. Young men who should have lived long lives, should have come home to families and careers and futures, were cremated in the wreckage of their aircraft or buried in military cemeteries far from home. Captain Wendell Pruitt and Captain Lee Archer were credited with destroying an enemy destroyer with their P-51s, a feat almost unheard of, attacking a warship with fighter aircraft. Lieutenant Clarence Lucky Lester shot down 3 German fighters in one day, becoming an ace in a single mission. Captain Edward Toppins flew over 100 combat missions, more than almost any other pilot in the group. Their names should be as famous as any white ace, but most people have never heard of them. And then the war ended. May 1945. Germany surrendered. The Tuskegee Airmen had compiled one of the most distinguished records of any fighter group in the war. They had earned 3 Distinguished Unit citations, the highest award a unit can receive. They had earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. They had earned 8 Purple Hearts. They had earned 14 Bronze Stars and 844 Air Medals. They came home, to segregation, to Jim Crow, to a nation that still wouldn't let them vote in the South, still wouldn't let them eat at most restaurants, still wouldn't let them stay in most hotels. They had risked their lives defending democracy and returned to a country that denied them basic democratic rights. Some of them took off their uniforms and never spoke about their service. The pain was too great, the betrayal too profound. They had proven everything they had been asked to prove, and nothing had changed. Others became activists, using their status as veterans to push for civil rights. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There's a photograph from 1945. Shows a group of Tuskegee Airmen standing in front of a P-51 Mustang somewhere in Italy. They're grinning, young, confident. They've just returned from a mission. They're alive. They're victorious. They have no idea that the hardest battles are still ahead of them, that the war for recognition will take longer than the war against Germany, that most of them will die before their service is fully acknowledged. The military remained segregated after World War II. The Tuskegee experience should have ended segregation immediately, but it didn't. Racism doesn't yield to evidence. It doesn't respond to logic. It takes power and pressure and legal action and decades of struggle. The Tuskegee Airmen had proved that Black Americans could fly, could fight, could excel under the most extreme conditions. And still, the military clung to segregation. It took President Harry Truman, in 1948, issuing Executive Order 9981 to officially desegregate the armed forces. Even then, implementation was slow, resisted by commanders who didn't want to change, who believed in the old ways. But the order had been given, and the evidence was irrefutable. The Tuskegee Airmen had made it impossible to maintain the lie that Black Americans were inferior as soldiers or pilots. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the man who had endured silence at West Point, who had commanded the 332nd through its darkest days, continued his military career. He became the first Black general in the United States. Air Force. He commanded fighter wings in Korea. He eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant general, a 3-star general, one of the highest-ranking Black officers in American military history. His success was built on the foundation laid at Tuskegee. But recognition for the Tuskegee Airmen as a group was slower. For decades, their story was known primarily in black communities, passed down through veterans organizations and family stories. Mainstream history ignored them. Textbooks didn't mention them. When World War II was taught, it was the story of white heroes, Patton and Eisenhower and Doolittle. The red tails were a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. It took until 1995, 50 years after the war ended, for the Tuskegee Airmen to be collectively recognized with their place in history beginning to be secured. A study by the Air Force confirmed their exceptional record. Books were written, documentaries were made. Veterans were invited to speak at schools and museums. The story began to spread. In 2007, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow, to the Tuskegee Airmen. About 300 aging veterans attended the ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda, many in wheelchairs, many in their 80s and 90s. They had waited 60 years for this moment. Some of their comrades hadn't lived to see it. But finally, the nation was acknowledging what they had done. "You helped win a war," President Bush told them, "and you helped change our nation for the better." In 2012, a group of Tuskegee Airmen attended the inauguration of President Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States. A moment that would have been unthinkable when they were training in Alabama in 1941, when they were fighting over Europe in 1944. They stood in Washington, wore their old uniforms or suits with lapel pins, marking them as Tuskegee Airmen, and watched as a black man took the oath of office. Some of them wept. All of them understood what it meant. The connection is direct. The civil rights movement, the desegregation of schools and public spaces, the Voting Rights Act, the slow, painful progress toward a more just society, all of it was built on the foundation that the Tuskegee Airmen helped lay. They proved that the supposed scientific evidence of black inferiority was a lie. They proved it in the most dramatic way possible, in combat, where there's no room for ambiguity. Either you can fly and fight or you can't. Either you succeed or you die. They succeeded. Every black astronaut who has flown in space, from Guion Bluford to Mae Jemison to the dozens who have followed, owes a debt to the Tuskegee Airmen. Every black military pilot, every black officer, every black American who has been able to pursue a career without being told that their race makes them inherently inferior, stands on the shoulders of those men who trained in Alabama and fought over Europe. And it cost them. It cost them years of their lives. It cost them friends and brothers who died in combat. It cost them the dignity of serving a country that didn't respect them. It cost them the recognition they deserved for decades after they earned it. The price they paid was incalculable. There's a broader lesson here, one that transcends this specific story, one that speaks to something fundamental about human nature and social change. Progress is not inevitable. Justice is not automatic. Systems of oppression do not collapse because they're morally wrong. They collapse because people fight them, because individuals decide that they will not accept what they've been told about themselves, because a group of young men from across America decided they would rather die proving they could fly than live accepting they couldn't. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't end racism. We're still fighting that battle. But they won a victory that mattered. They shattered a myth that had been used to justify oppression for generations. They opened a door that had been locked. They created possibilities that hadn't existed before. And they did it by being excellent, by being brave, by being stubborn enough to refuse defeat. Think about what it required, not just physical courage, though they had that in abundance, not just skill, though they proved they were as good as any pilots in the world. It required a different kind of strength. The strength to maintain your dignity when everyone around you is trying to strip it away. The strength to prove yourself every single day when you know the standards are rigged against you. The strength to fight for a country that doesn't love you back. That's the kind of strength we should remember. That's the kind of courage that built the America we have today, imperfect as it is. The courage of people who believed in the promise of American ideals, even when America was failing to live up to them, who fought not just to save the nation, but to perfect it, to force it to become what it claimed to be. The last of the Tuskegee Airmen are dying now. Time is undefeated. The youngest of them would be in their late 90s or early hundreds if still alive. Every year, fewer of them attend reunions, fewer are able to tell their stories in person. Soon, there will be none left. And when they're gone, all we'll have are the stories, the records, the photographs, the memorials. This is why these stories matter. This is why they need to be told and retold and passed down to every new generation. Not just because they're inspiring, though they are. Not just because they're dramatic, though they are. But because they're true. They're evidence. They're proof that people can overcome systems designed to crush them. That courage and determination and excellence can triumph over prejudice and hatred and institutional oppression. The Tuskegee Airmen were told they couldn't fly. They flew. They were told they would fail. They succeeded. They were told. They were inferior. They proved they were exceptional. They did it while fighting two wars, one against the Germans and one against their own country's racism. And they won both. Not immediately, not perfectly, not without cost. But they won. The arc of their story bends toward justice, but it bends because they pulled it that way, through effort and sacrifice and blood. So when you hear someone say that systemic change is impossible, remember the Tuskegee Airmen. When you hear that certain people can't achieve certain things because of their background or their race or their circumstances, remember the men who trained in the Alabama desert and flew over Berlin. When you hear that fighting injustice is futile, that the system is too powerful to challenge, that nothing ever really changes, remember the Red Tails. They changed everything, not by being perfect, not by winning every battle, but by refusing to quit, by proving, mission after mission, flight after flight, that they belonged in that sky, that they deserved those wings, that they were Americans, full citizens of the country they were defending, even when that country refused to acknowledge it. There's a memorial now at Tuskegee, bronze statues of pilots in their flight gear, a wall with the names of everyone who trained there, everyone who earned those wings, everyone who flew. Visitors come from around the world. They read the names. They learn the story. They ask the same question. How did they do it? How did they maintain the discipline and the excellence and the dignity under those conditions? The answer is community. The answer is that they did it for each other. Every Tuskegee Airman knew that if he failed, it would be used as evidence against every black American, and every Tuskegee Airman knew that if he succeeded, he was opening doors for those who would come after. The weight should have been unbearable, but they carried it together. They supported each other. They refused to let each other fail. That's another lesson. Systemic change requires collective action. Individual heroism matters, but it's not enough. The Tuskegee Airmen succeeded because they were a group, a community, a brotherhood. They trained together, they fought together, they held each other accountable, they celebrated each other's victories and mourned each other's losses. They understood that they were not just individuals, but part of something larger. And that's true for any movement, for justice, civil rights, women's suffrage, labor rights, LGBTQ equality. Every victory in the long march toward a more just society has been won by communities of people who refused to accept the status quo, who supported each other through the struggle, who understood that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for everyone who would come after. The Tuskegee Airmen are part of that story. Their specific battle was against military segregation and racial prejudice in the armed forces. But their victory resonated far beyond that narrow context. They provided evidence, impossible to dismiss, that the entire structure of Jim Crow was built on lies. That separate was not equal, that given the opportunity, Black Americans could achieve anything white Americans could achieve. That evidence was used in courtrooms. Thurgood Marshall, who had been one of the lawyers fighting to create the Tuskegee program, later argued Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court. The court's decision in 1954, declaring school segregation unconstitutional, was built on the foundation that the Tuskegee Airmen had helped create. The evidence they provided that Black Americans were not inferior was part of the case that finally toppled legal segregation. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the lunch counter sit-ins in 1960, the Freedom Rides in 1961, the March on Washington in 1963. Every major event of the civil rights movement happened in a context that had been shaped in part by what the Tuskegee Airmen had proven during World War II. They hadn't ended racism, but they had undermined one of its key justifications, and that mattered. Some of the Tuskegee Airmen became direct participants in the civil rights movement. They used their status as veterans, their visibility as heroes, to push for change. They marched, they organized, they spoke, they refused to be silent. Others lived quieter lives, raising families, building careers, never seeking recognition. But all of them, by their existence, by their service, had contributed to the cause. And now, in the 21st century, their story is finally being told widely. Movies have been made, documentaries have been produced, books have been written, schools teach about them, children learn their names. The Tuskegee Airmen have entered the pantheon of American heroes, taking their rightful place alongside the other great figures of World War II. But even now, the story is often sanitized. The comfortable version is that they faced discrimination. They overcame it through excellence. America recognized its mistake, and everyone lived happily ever after. That's not the story. The real story is messier, harder, more painful. They faced discrimination. They overcame it through excellence. America ignored them for decades. They fought for recognition almost as long as they fought in the war. Some of them died bitter, feeling that their service had been wasted. And even today, even with congressional gold medals and monuments and movies, the work of building a truly just society is unfinished. That's the truth we have to sit with. The Tuskegee Airmen did something extraordinary. They proved something crucial. They changed history. And it wasn't enough. It was necessary, but not sufficient. Justice required their victory, but it required 100 other victories as well. It required decades of struggle by millions of people. It required laws and court cases and protests and political organizing. It required people who were willing to sacrifice, to suffer, to die for a cause larger than themselves. And it's still not done. We honor the Tuskegee Airmen not just by remembering them, but by continuing the work they started, by fighting against injustice wherever we find it, by refusing to accept systems that tell certain people they're inferior, by building communities that support each other in the struggle for a better world, by being excellent even when the standards are rigged against us, by refusing to quit even when the fight seems hopeless. That's what they taught us. That's their legacy. Not just that they were brave pilots who flew in World War II, but that they were human beings who refused to accept the limitations placed on them by an unjust society, who fought back, who won, who changed the world. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The Tuskegee Airmen were not superheroes. They were men, flawed, human, scared sometimes, angry sometimes, exhausted often, but they did something superhuman. They maintained their dignity and their excellence under conditions that were designed to break them. They proved that the scientific racism, the military doctrine, the entire structure of American segregation was a lie. And they did it by being so good that even their enemies couldn't deny it. That's available to us. That kind of courage, that kind of determination, that kind of commitment to something larger than ourselves. It's not easy. It wasn't easy for them. But it's possible. They proved it's possible. And every time you face a system that tells you that you can't do something because of who you are, remember the Tuskegee Airmen. Remember the men who were told their brains were too small to fly, and who ended up protecting bombers over Berlin. Remember the men who were trained in the Jim Crow South and who integrated the United States military. Remember the men who died defending a country that didn't respect them and who changed that country by their sacrifice. Remember that they won, not easily, not quickly, not completely. But they won. They opened doors. They created possibilities. They proved that change is possible, that justice can be achieved, that courage and excellence can triumph over prejudice and hatred. That's the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. That's the story that needs to be told. Not a sanitized fairy tale of inevitable progress, but the hard, complex, painful, triumphant truth of what they accomplished and what it cost them and why it matters. They were told they couldn't fly. They flew. They were told they were inferior. They proved they were exceptional. They were denied recognition. They fought for it and won it. They were treated as less than human. They responded by being more human than their oppressors could understand. And in doing so, they didn't just win a war. They helped build a country. The America we live in today, imperfect as it is the America they helped create. Every right we take for granted, every opportunity we have, every step toward justice stands on the foundation they built. So when you think about the Tuskegee Airmen, don't just think about red-tailed Mustangs over Germany, though that image is powerful and true. Think about young men studying in segregated barracks in Alabama, determined to prove the world wrong. Think about pilots staying with their bombers when glory beckoned elsewhere, understanding that their mission was about more than individual achievement. Think about veterans coming home to a country that still wouldn't let them vote, and deciding to fight for change rather than accepting defeat. Think about old men in their 80s and 90s, finally receiving the recognition they had earned 60 years before, and having the grace to accept it with dignity rather than bitterness. Think about the price they paid, the friends lost, the years fighting for acknowledgement, the dignity stripped away daily by a segregated society, the weight of representation, of knowing that every mistake would be used as evidence against an entire race, the exhaustion of having to be twice as good to be considered equal. And think about what they won. The integration of the military, the evidence that helped topple legal segregation, the inspiration for the civil rights movement, the opening of doors for everyone who came after, the proof, undeniable and eternal, that excellence has no color. That's the story. That's what they did. That's why we remember them, not because they were perfect, but because they were courageous, not because they had easy victories, but because they fought impossible battles and won, not because America treated them well, but because they refused to let America's failures define them. The last red-tail pilots are disappearing. Soon, the last veteran will be gone. But the story remains, the lesson remains, the inspiration remains, and the responsibility remains. The responsibility to continue the work they started, to fight for justice, to refuse to accept systems that diminish human dignity, to be excellent even when the standards are rigged, to support each other in the struggle, to remember that change is possible because they proved it. That's what the Tuskegee Airmen gave us. Not just a story of World War II heroism, though it is that, but a blueprint for how to fight systemic injustice, how to maintain dignity under oppression, how to prove your worth when the world denies it, how to change the world when the world won't change for you. They did it by flying, by fighting, by being so good that even their enemies had to acknowledge it, by refusing to quit when quitting would have been understandable, by carrying a weight that should have crushed them and turning it into wings. That's the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. That's the legacy of the Red Tails. That's what they proved in the skies over Alabama and Italy and Germany. That courage can triumph. That excellence can overcome prejudice. That a group of determined people fighting together for something larger than themselves can change the world. They told us we couldn't fly. We flew. They told us we were inferior. We proved we were exceptional. They denied us recognition. We earned it anyway. They tried to break us. We refused to break. That's the message. That's the lesson. That's what every generation needs to hear and remember and pass on. The Tuskegee Airmen showed us that the fight for justice is long and hard and costly, but it can be won. That systems of oppression are powerful, but they're not invincible. That human dignity cannot be destroyed, only obscured, and that it's worth fighting to reveal it. So remember their names: Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Roscoe Brown, Clarence Lucky Lester, Edward Toppins, Lee Archer, Charles McGee, who lived to age 102 and flew 409 combat missions across 3 wars. Remember the ones who didn't come home. Remember the ones who came home to a segregated country and kept fighting. Remember the ones who lived long enough to see a black president and the ones who didn't. Remember that they were real people, who were scared and brave and angry and hopeful, who made mistakes and achieved greatness, who were human in all the ways that matter, who proved that being human is enough, that excellence is available to anyone willing to sacrifice for it, that justice is possible for anyone willing to fight for it. That's the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, not a myth, not a legend, the truth. Complex, painful, triumphant truth. And that truth is a gift they gave us, purchased with their service and their sacrifice, and their refusal to accept what they were told about themselves. We honor them by telling their story. We honor them by continuing their fight. We honor them by refusing to quit when the struggle seems hopeless. We honor them by being excellent, by supporting each other, by believing in the possibility of justice even when the evidence suggests it's impossible. Because they proved it's possible. That's what they gave us. That's what we owe them to remember. That's why their story matters, not just as history, but as inspiration and instruction and hope. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails, the men who were told they couldn't fly and who ended up showing the world how it's done, the men who fought 2 wars and won both, the men who paid an impossible price and earned an immortal legacy. Remember them, learn from them, be inspired by them, and when you face your own battles against systems that tell you that you're not enough, remember that a group of young black men from segregated America faced down the most powerful military in the world and an even more powerful system of racial oppression, and they won. If they could do that, with everything arrayed against them, imagine what we can do together. Imagine what's possible when we refuse to accept the limitations placed on us. Imagine what we can achieve when we support each other and fight for something larger than ourselves. That's the final lesson of the Tuskegee Airmen. That courage is contagious, that excellence inspires, that justice, though it arrives late, eventually arrives if people are willing to fight for it. That the arc of history bends toward justice only when people like them grab it and pull. They grabbed it, they pulled, they changed the world. And they did it while flying red-tailed Mustangs over the burning skies of Europe, proving with every mission that they belonged there, that they deserved those wings, that they were worthy of the title they had claimed against all odds. American pilots, American heroes, American citizens who forced America to live up to its own ideals. That's who the Tuskegee Airmen were. That's what they did. That's why we remember. And that's why their story will never die, as long as there are people willing to fight for justice, willing to refuse defeat, willing to prove the world wrong by being excellent. They were told they couldn't fly. They flew. And in doing so, they taught us all how to soar.